Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Erin, and I am joined by my wonderful, adorable, sweet, amazing, is that too many adjectives, husband, Matthew.
Hi, everybody. I'm back again.
Hi. Thanks, everybody, for continuing to listen to our series on Mary Todd Lincoln. We are going to finish up her story today. But before I get into that, I do want to remind everybody to rate, review, subscribe to the podcast. If you listen to it, it really does help people find the podcast. It makes us happy. We also have a Patreon. So if you want more content, and let's be honest, who wouldn't want more content? You can find the links to that in the show notes. All right. Are you ready to get back into the world of Mary Todd Lincoln?
I think so, but boy, it was a very sad ending to the last episode. So
It was.
I'll pretend that I'm ready, but I don't know.
I know. We left off with Mary Todd Lincoln having watched her husband be assassinated in front of her and being unable to be by his bedside when he died. We all heard me cry. Hopefully I don't do that again today, but no promises. Let's not go back there. But, of course, we're going to have to deal with the aftermath of President Lincoln's assassination. I mean, if it's hard for us, I honestly don't know how Mary proceeded in those hours and days after the assassination. We know she took to her bed, like after Willie died, for about 40 days. She even refused to stay in her usual bedroom in the White House, suddenly for a spare room that held no memories of her husband. Even the noises outside as they created a platform for Lincoln's body spooked her. Today, I think we would understand it as PTSD, but obviously they didn't have that language to use it, but it really does sound like it. We have a description of it, quote, "The other night when putting them up, every plank that dropped gave her a spasm, and every nail driven reminded her of a pistol shot," end quote. You can imagine that everything is going to scare her, spook her in these days afterwards. To be fair, I'm sure she also felt a little bit of danger for herself and the remaining family that she had left.
Right. Because this is during the time where there's speculation that this might, well, we talked about this during the John Wilkes Booth Manhunt podcast. Is that the Patreon episode that we did?
Yep.
That there's a widespread anxiety that, maybe this is some kind of conspiracy and there may be other assassins out there lurking, wanting to wound the family in some way.
Yeah, I can only imagine how it felt. In these days, Mary would be tended to by her spiritualist friends and people like Lizzie Keckley, who was her seamstress and dressmaker. Her birth family, the Todds, did not come to Mary's assistance to provide emotional support. Elizabeth, her eldest sister, was feuding with Mary at the time of the assassination, as her husband had been removed from his job by Abraham Lincoln. Of course, a job that Lincoln had given him.
Oh.
So, nepotism. We already spoke about the other Confederate Todds, so Mary was not going to have any comfort there. Typically, Mary, as First Lady, should have been receiving visitors who came to pay their respects, but she refused. The new president, Andrew Johnson, did not try, nor did he write to her. Mary would never forget the slight. She's always going to remember that Andrew Johnson, in her hour of grieving, did not even attempt to come and comfort her. Andrew Johnson's a real piece of shit, so we shouldn't be surprised.
You don't think he'll make the podcast as somebody who's kind of teetering on the fence? Okay. I think most historians would probably line up behind that conclusion.
I think in another episode I mentioned, we did have somebody mention him, and just less that he was good or that there'd be some nuance, but more like, is he as bad as we expect? So maybe he'll appear at some point, but yeah, there's not a lot of redeeming qualities about him, and it doesn't sound like this was a shining moment for him either. We know from the few that caught a glimpse of the newly widowed Mrs. Lincoln that she made herself sick from sobbing, quote, broke by the horrors of that dreadful night, as well as worn down by bodily sickness, end quote. So she's crying. She's making herself sick. She's not taking care of herself. Of course, even as Mary grieved, the world continued to go on outside of her room. With her husband dead, Mary was, in fact, no longer the first lady, and she was expected to leave the White House to make room for, Andrew Johnson, the new president, and his family. It's hard. You do see this play out in the post-Kennedy assassination, too, the fact that you're in mourning, but then you have the real logistics that you're no longer welcome in the White House. They'll let you pack up your stuff, but got to move because there's a new president. There's no period of interregnum. There's a new president and he wants to get into the White House. You really feel for Mary in this situation that she had to leave the White House, and the White House had been their home. It wasn't just a place of state and government, but it was their home, and it was the last place that she had been with her husband.
It's also the case that we have to remember any attempt on her part to try and just maybe steal 15 minutes of like conscious denial. I'm just going to pretend for a little bit this isn't happening. As impossible as that must be, it's doubly impossible when you have to watch the scaffolding going up and soldiers assembling to guard the body as it lies in state in the rotunda, and you're being asked your thoughts on all of these details of how your martyred husband's going to be laid to rest. So you can't escape it. And in the meantime, you're asking yourself, oh, I need to remind myself that in a week or so, I don't have a place to live.
It's not like they had a place lined up. They were going to be in the White House for another couple years. She thought that she was going to have years to wrap her mind around being out of the White House, what their next part of their life was going to look like. And now, suddenly, everything's changed. You're abandoning those memories forever. And you're abandoning her own ambitions. She had wanted the presidency as much, if not more, than her husband. And now whatever ambition she had harbored for the rest of his term in their lives, that's gone. She can't run for office as a woman, even if she wanted to. And I don't think she would have wanted to if she had been allowed, as she was, we talked about in the previous episode that she's at heart conservative. She believes there's a place for women, there's a place for men. So she wouldn't have been out wanting to run for office, even if she could. The best that she could do was to guide her husband. And without him, she's nothing. And the incoming president is not somebody that you get along with. He's far from a friend. We know that Andrew Johnson and Mary had their own fractured relationship, with Mary even speculating to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who would lead the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth, that Johnson might have been involved as a conspirator. She really did think that Johnson might have been involved in the Booth conspiracy. There's a quote from her that said, "I had been impressed with the harrowing thought that he, Johnson, had an understanding with the conspirators, and they knew their man. Did not Booth say there is one thing he could not tell?" End quote. Don't think that Andrew Johnson was actually involved. I don't know how her brain got there, but she certainly felt like it. So you have to add that complexity to the mix. It's not like she felt like she was handing the baton to a friend or somebody that was going to uphold her husband's legacy.
Right. And we should point out, too, that Johnson cuts his teeth politically by being a Union Democrat. He's from Tennessee. I think we hinted at this earlier, that the Republican Party at this point is so much in its infancy that when Lincoln seeks re-election in 1964, they formally pitched themselves to the voters as the Constitution and Union Party. And Lincoln's the Republican at the head of the ticket, but his vice presidential running mate, with whom he has almost nothing in common, and they don't have a relationship, they don't strategize together, they don't make decisions together, which is the norm for the vice presidency.
Yeah, there's no closeness there, even personally.
Yeah, so he and Johnson are not pals. The biographies of Johnson indicate, some of them kind of callously, that, he couldn't even write his own name until he was 12 or 13 years old. And he emerged politically as a force by essentially framing himself as a representative of the hardscrabble frontier farmer, somebody who comes from the hill country culture that resents the cotton plantation elite. And they also resent probably Kentucky blue bloods
Like Mary.
like Mary. And she in turn would probably be inclined to look down her nose at people like him, right?
Yeah, thinking that he's a hick.
There's a lot of reasons for her to have some friction with the new president.
Yeah. And again, correct or not, she, at least in her mind, she thinks that maybe he's even involved in the assassination. These are really trying times. And it's not until late May that Mary finally left the White House. She must have imagined this day in the future, far ahead, but she would have never imagined it without her husband. And when she emerged into the world, Mary, in her widowhood, modeled herself in a way after Queen Victoria, who wore black for the rest of her life after the death of her husband, Prince Albert. Customarily, a woman would wear black for the first 2 years of mourning, not for Victoria, not for Mary. Mary would wear black widow's weeds, as they were called, for the remaining 17 years of her life. For a woman who loved clothes from her childhood, we spoke about her creating her own hoop skirt as a child. After all, this change in wardrobe was more than just a change in appearance. There would be no end to the mourning. It would cast a very long shadow. In terms of where Mary would live next, she did not want to go back to Springfield, to the house where Eddie had died, and without her husband. It would be too painful. So she settled for Chicago instead, with her 2 remaining sons, Robert and Tad. In need of something to give her attention to, Mary focused on the youngest, Tad.
Uh-oh. It just seems like everyone that she reaches out to for support vanishes.
Yes. So. And at 12 years old, Tad was in need of attention. He'd kind of been a little bit forgotten. He finally attended school for the first time there in Chicago. He likely had some sort of speech issue and was essentially illiterate. Willie had been the obvious favorite child, which we talked about in the last episode. Poor baby Tad, he seemed forgotten among the bunch and a little bit of an embarrassment to his mother. So now he's the focus. She wants to get him in school, which he is. And when Mary was not focused on Tad, she was telling the story of the assassination a lot. Her mood remained dark, sometimes bordering on suicidal, at least in language. She didn't have any attempt to end her life in any way. On the first anniversary of the assassination, Mary finally bought a real home for what remained of the Lincoln family. But whatever attempt at moving on with life as much as she could, the industry of Abraham Lincoln proved too much for some to bear. It was then, with the loss of her husband still sore, that the Anne Rutledge story began to make waves. The source of it was an old foe of Mary's and mine, because he's my foe now, William Herndon, Abraham Lincoln's old law partner. We mentioned him a lot in part 1, but as a reminder, if you've forgotten, he worked with Abraham Lincoln for many years. His relationship with Mary had always been strained after supposedly he insulted her dancing, and she never welcomed him into their home, either in Springfield or the White House. So definitely an enemy of hers, and he got the ultimate revenge. In 1866, again, just a year after the assassination, Herndon gave a lecture in Springfield about, quote, A. Lincoln, Miss Anne Rutledge, New Salem, pioneering the poem. In this lecture, the lore of Anne Rutledge, Abraham Lincoln's supposed first love, was born. We talked a little bit about Anne Rutledge in the first episode, but Matt, I don't know if you want to give like really quick 1 minute, 2 minute summary just to sum it up for people, since I know that was a really long episode, so he might not remember.
I don't know that we will ever know all of the details.
It's definitely contested.
Anne Rutledge died, we think, of typhoid fever in the mid 1830s when Lincoln was still in his 20s. And there is some evidence that they may have even been engaged, but we don't have, letters between the two to authenticate that. And it's something that emerges, as you're about to point out, in the 1870s, I guess, by this point, that, this was really his first love, his true love. This would be back in New Salem. And once she died, that was
it for him.
That was like the great animating tragedy of his life. And therefore, he married Mary because it was the responsible, virtuous thing to do.
Yeah.
Not because he really loved her. And we should point out there's a famous book that goes through this called Lincoln in American Memory.
Oh, really?
It's an old book. It's by Merrill Peterson. But one of the things it points out is that Lincoln technically, he's assassinated, he's shot on Good Friday. And most of the country is coming to grips with his death on Sunday because it happens early Saturday. So as the news drifts out, so very early on, within like a week, you'll see these newspaper prints where George Washington is in the clouds, opening his hands while Lincoln floats to heaven. It's a very kind of Christian imagery. Here's our martyred president.
He's our American Jesus.
He's dying for the original sin of slavery. The Anne Rutledge story then is like of a perfect, I guess, complement to that claim, because now you can say, well, during Lincoln's lost years, when he was a young man in Illinois, the reason he came to us, the reason that he saw his life's mission as intertwined with our own future, our own goals as a people, is because his own chance to truly have love, it just didn't work out because God took Anne from him. Meanwhile, here you are, you're Mary.
Yes.
You're going to lose 3 of your 4 sons. You've already lost your husband.
Your husband.
And you have to watch this.
Yes. Oh, don't worry. I've got words.
It's enough to make you mad.
Don't say it.
Crazy.
Or crazy.
Yeah. Insane, maybe.
Yeah.
But justifiably so.
Yes. Herndon's words on Anne Rutledge were brutal and lasting, as he said. She is just a barb, a weapon of feminine goodness in contrast to Mary. About Anne's early death, Herndon said that Abraham Lincoln, quote, had lost the woman he should have married. So, if it's not clear enough, Herndon called Abraham Lincoln's marriage to Mary Todd, quote, a domestic hell. For the last 23 years of his life, Mr. Lincoln had no joy, end quote. I'm going to keep going because I will talk about that, but you guys know what I'm thinking. The Chicago Tribune printed this speech, so it was public. It's not just something private that was going around. No, it's public. It's in the newspapers. It was for public consumption. Mary read it in the newspaper. She would not speak publicly on it, but privately hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. She was so angry, and she remained furious at Herndon and his interpretation of her marriage. Even as other people who knew Abraham Lincoln denied the extent to which Abraham loved Anne. Again, the Anne Rutledge thing is not set in stone. Not every person agreed with it. But ultimately, Herndon got the last laugh. The eternal love between Anne and Abraham remains with Lincoln's legacy today. Herndon's idea of Mary being a consolation prize, or worse, for Abraham Lincoln, not his true love, that idea has stuck with us. Listeners might remember, and I'm sure you remember reading Edgar Lee Masters. He's an American poet. He wrote Spoon River Anthology. In it, he has Anne Rutledge speaking from beyond the grave. I'm going to quote it. And this is the idea that we still get of her. That's why I wanted to quote it. I am Anne Rutledge, who sleep beneath these weeds, beloved in life of Abraham Lincoln, wedded to him, not through union, but through separation. End quote. So, I'm angry. Yeah.
Unfair.
It is. The idea of never being able to escape that lore of your husband's, it makes me really sad. It makes me really sad for her. And I told you, we've had discussions about this. I want to drive to Springfield and spit on William Herndon's grave. I want to do it so bad. I don't care about the truth of the matter if Anne really wasn't as important to Abraham as Herndon said. The fact that he does this a year after the assassination is when he makes this little speech. It boggles the mind, the cruelty of it. Like, you couldn't at least wait a little bit longer. This was the time to get your cash money and throw the rest of the Lincoln family under the proverbial bus, because even if he hated Mary, there are still two sons of Abraham and Mary alive at this point. You would think that maybe for the sake of them that you wouldn't do it. And if Herndon was ever a true friend to Abraham, this just seems so unbelievably cruel to do, again, not just to his widow, but to his sons. Do you not agree? Or are you a Herndon fanboy?
I'm no Herndon apologist. I guess the reason I delay, the reason I fumble is I've always wanted to know what his motive was. And I don't understand. Obviously, I understand why he wants to be the custodian of Lincoln's memory, because whether he's honest with himself or not, it's going to be
money.
It's going to be a mechanism for him to profit. Right.
Cash money.
But why do you have to dismantle Mary Todd Lincoln in the process? I just don't get it.
Yeah. And again, even if you hate the woman, you hate the woman. But if Abraham Lincoln was your friend, again, two living sons of Mary and Abraham, you couldn't at least wait a couple years after the next year. The country has hardly gotten over the assassination in a year. You think Mary has? You think the family has? I don't know. But I know Robert, the oldest Lincoln son, he had to beg William Herndon to stop a planned tour. He was going to go on tour. He was going to take his cruelty on tour. Luckily, that did not happen because he at least respected Robert's wishes. And again, no matter what you think of Mary Lincoln, she certainly divided opinion. Having someone a year after you lost your husband violently say that he never loved you, that you made him miserable, and then to say that publicly to be printed in newspapers in full. Spitting on a man's grave suddenly seems too good for him.
You want to dig him up and
put him on trial? Yeah. So when the popes did to another pope, why not?
That was Formosus, I think. That's one of the rare ones I remember.
All right.
Struck me as that's serious commitment, because they actually put him in a chair then for the trial.
Well, why else would you dig him up if you're not going to plop him in a chair?
Well, I assume Cross X was a little bit one-sided. What do I know?
I'm just saying, if you want to grab a shovel, I can put in coordinates to Springfield.
But let's make it worse. I'm just going to go ahead and throw this out there then. So you would think during this process then that the one surviving son...
Well, he's not the one. There's two. There's still two. Tad. So
I know.
The eldest. He's an adult.
Are you going to break this to the listeners? What becomes of Tad?
Well, I think you already did. You already said that she lost 3 kids, so... But Robert Lincoln is an adult.
And that's the question I'm building towards, is you would think that for everything Herndon does, why can't Robert stick up for his mom? And not only is he not going to do that, but there's far worse coming. Yes.
Robert and Mary, they're two very, very different people. The book that I read, which is, if I quote anything, it's from Mary Todd Lincoln, a biography by Jean Baker. It basically was like, Robert wasn't a Lincoln. He was not a Todd. He was something else. He was very different than both his parents, which we will find out because his actions are not like his mother's, and you could never see Abraham Lincoln doing what Robert ends up doing. I'll have a whole rant for Robert later, so don't you worry. But if I think about William Herndon anymore, I really will put it in. I was going to say MapQuest, but that's not a thing anymore.
Ooh, you are dating yourself with that.
Oh, no.
Why don't you just get the atlas out of the back of the car?
I will put it in MapQuest. We will print out these instructions, and then we will drive. No. Google Maps.
It's behind this orthopedic pillow that I keep in the driver's seat.
Anyway, to move on, the biggest theme of Mary's post-White House years was a lack of money. Money was always an issue, and not just because of her spending, but because the Lincolns had not exactly been rolling in money before entering the White House, and the expenses for parties and, well, everything had piled up. Now she had no husband to earn money for them either. She was living on $130 a month, not much at all, as she waited for Abraham Lincoln's estate to be distributed, and it was taking a really long time to get that estate distributed. She hoped for a pension like many other war widows, but that too was stuck in Congress. Never wanted to sit back and wait for events to play out. Mary had an idea to give herself some additional money to live on. Mary's idea, which I do think we would say now sounds like a good one. Cloaked in mourning attire for the rest of her life, Mary had plenty of exquisite, very expensive clothes and accessories that she no longer had any need for. Selling those would bring in some funds while she waited for Congress to take up her pension issue. With her beloved friend and seamstress, Lizzie Keckley, Mary went to New York City in the fall of 1867. Because of Lizzie being a freed Black woman, the pair would have to settle for an attic room in the hotel, the only integrated space offered. There in the city, Mary contacted pawnbrokers to help with the sale. Mary herself wrote to friends of her husband, political allies for support with the sale, hoping they would buy something. But no longer beholden to Mary's husband, these former friends turned their back on Mary. Only Frederick Douglass and other members of the Black community supported Mary, with Douglass even volunteering to go on a lecture tour with all the money raised going towards Mary, which is an amazing offer, so gracious, but Mary refused. While her husband had been responsible for the end of slavery and Lizzie Keckley was one of her closest friends, Mary's ideas on race shouldn't be perceived in some sort of idealized fashion. She really didn't want to be making money from Frederick Douglass and these Black community members. He kind of wished Mary would have said yes to this, because we're going to hear what happens next does not go well for her. But I did want to point that out for Frederick Douglass, because that's very sweet and makes me think even more of Frederick Douglass. He stands by his man, so to speak.
He's definitely, as early as 1848, he's as active in the women's movement as he is in, obviously, abolition. Although there's a great parting of the ways that happens with the early feminist movement and the Black civil rights movement during Reconstruction. Yeah. That's a different subject for a different podcast. He's definitely an advocate for her. And I do have to put a plug in for Behind the Scenes, Keckley's book. It's outside copyright. I think the University of North Carolina has a full copy of it online.
Oh, nice.
It's a really fascinating read. And I think the first publication date is 1868. So it's coming out during the height of radical Reconstruction.
Yes, and I will be talking about it because it obviously talks about Mary. It's amazing that since it's outside of copyright, you can read it. You don't have to buy it. It's always nice that you can access that stuff online. I do think it's important that just because Mary had Lizzie Keckley as her friend, we talked about Abraham Lincoln too, and his complicated, so to speak, ideas of race and race relations. You do have to put it out there that we shouldn't see her in some sort of idealized fashion. So, in perhaps an unadvised move, the pawnbroker sent Mary's letter to the press, the letters that she had written to all of Abraham Lincoln's friends, colleagues, hoping that it would encourage sympathy for her and anger towards the politicians who refused to help Lincoln's widow. If that was the hope, it failed horribly. When it was found out that Mary was doing a public showing of her clothes with intent to make money off of them, the outcry was immense. The press ridiculed her for selling her secondhand things, and while many attended the showing, it was a sideshow. It was entertainment after having been lambasted in the press. Mary blamed the press for turning the showing into a joke and railed against her husband's friends who had not helped her out by buying items. She's angry. She's grieving. She made the names public of those Republicans who she had reached out to. So it's becoming insanely messy, and it's looking like, even if she didn't intend it, it looked like she was blackmailing the men for not having bought anything. In the end, Mary ended up spending more than she actually made from the attempted selling of her clothes. This is a horrible disaster. Worse yet, her reputation was in ruins. The clothing scandal remained in the papers for weeks on end. And this is where we get the first suggestion that Mary might, in fact, be insane. So I'm going to use insane. I'm going to use the term lunatic. I'm just using the terms from the time, just FYI. Not the terms that we would use nowadays, but we're going to go with the terminology for the time. The Chicago Journal said in the days after the sale, quote, "The most charitable construction that Mary Lincoln's friend can put on her strange course is that she is insane," end quote. Their point of view is the only reason she could possibly be doing this is that she was insane. Not that she needed money, it was that she has to be insane. And Robert Lincoln, the oldest son of Mary and Abraham, was furious at his mother for having brought embarrassment to the whole family. And it's around this time that Robert seems to have started to float the idea that his mom was, in fact, insane. They're dropping hints of that in the papers, but it's setting the stage for something. Robert and Mary had never really had a warm relationship as he grew up. As we said, he's the opposite of the emotional Mary, and this scandal drove an even larger wedge between the two. Fortunately for Mary, Lincoln's estate was ready to be distributed by November of 1867, so about a month or so after the clothing sale debacle. Mary only found out about it from the papers, so she didn't even get notified. She had to find out about this from the papers, and she also saw in the papers that while she was living on the $130 a month, her son Robert was given twice as much, and he had gotten $3,000 for an investment and more money to, quote, fix up his bachelor quarters.
I just doesn't stop.
You can't see me, but I'm side-eyeing Robert here. Not the last time I was side-eyeing him, but dear Lord, if I had seen that I was barely getting by, and then my son was getting not just money for an investment, but to fix up his bachelor quarters, you really would call me insane because I would burn the whole frickin' city to the ground. It's not just me that's side-eyeing Robert. Mary was also side-eyeing her oldest son because she also suspected he had something to do with the speeding things up on the estate. She thought he was doing so to prevent her from getting any more money from her clothing. It made her look rapacious and greedy by begging for money for her clothes when she suddenly had this windfall of cash. But at least for now, with the estate, Mary was on much firmer footing in terms of her financial situation. There would be more betrayals, though, this time from a friend. We already mentioned that her beloved seamstress and friend, Lizzie Keckley, wrote a tell-all memoir about her time, both in slavery and in the Lincoln White House. Again, the title is Behind the Scenes, 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. It was published in 1868. There are conflicting reports that the women fell out completely after this. Some people say that they still stayed in touch, but they certainly weren't as close.
Right, as they had been during the war years.
we can say for sure that Mary felt it was a betrayal of their friendship. You do have to feel for Lizzie Keckley because Mary still had plenty of debts with her friend. She had not paid her because she was living off of hardly any money. And then even after getting money from Lincoln's estate, she hadn't paid up. So Lizzie's doing just like Mary had to do. She's doing what she had to do to survive. Mary saw enemies everywhere, and was ready to banish anybody who she felt as disloyal. This is the thing about her. Mary's never had a nuanced view of people. They're either with her or against her. And for Lizzie to have written this tell-all memoir that put her firmly in the against her category.
That was a betrayal.
Yeah, which I understand. Again, 68, that's still 3 years after the assassination. I'm not going to blame Lizzie Keckley because, dear Lord, her life is intense. I haven't read the full memoir, but I've read parts. Her life story is dramatic, and I certainly hope that if there are things that you want to follow up on after this episode, going down the Lizzie Keckley rabbit hole would be very worthwhile. But I see both sides. I see Lizzie's side. I see Mary's side. To escape the notoriety that stalked her after the clothing sale, as well as these tell-alls, Mary ended up going abroad with her youngest son, Tad, staying in Germany for 2 years. While in Germany, she made friends with U.S. expats, and there was even a rumor at one point that Mary was going to remarry. Of course, that would never have happened. She remained married to her husband's legacy. I don't think remarrying ever really crossed her mind. The rumors happened right around the time when the pension bill was ready to be up. Mary erupted in fury, thinking the rumor of another marriage, especially it was supposed to be to some random count. She was thinking that it intended to ruin her character and, again, make the need for more funds seem silly. So people were like, why would she need pension? She's going to marry a count. She was not going to marry a count. In addition to socializing, Mary was spending a lot still on herself, of course, but a lot of the attention and the money that went towards Robert and his wife, Mary Harlan, who was the daughter of a senator. Gifts upon gifts went across the ocean. Continental styles for her daughter-in-law, bonnets. She wrote a lot to her daughter-in-law, Mary. There's two Marys. It's Mary and Mary. There's Mary Lincoln and then Mary Harlan, who, well, I guess is also Mary Lincoln because she's married to Robert. But she wrote a lot to her daughter-in-law, especially after Robert's wife became pregnant. She had a lot of advice for her. One of my favorites was, quote, "Don't mope around the house, attend operas and concerts," end quote. She wanted the young woman to continue to enjoy herself, as Mary said, quote, "Trouble comes soon enough, my dear child," end quote. I think Mary was well aware of the troubles that could happen after you start to have family. With the new baby, Mary found happiness buying suitably grand outfits for the little girl, which Robert thought were much too extravagant. There was a lot of disagreements between mom and son about the things that she was buying for her. But even with friends and shopping, the grief never abated and never lessened. One friend who visited her noted, quote, "I never knew what the word alone meant. Mary Lincoln was completely overwhelmed with grief. Her sobs and tears wrung my heart, and I thought, if her tormentors and slanderers could see her, they might surely be satisfied," end quote. That quote just gets me. No matter what you think of her, and she does certainly have her flaws, as we all do, but she paid for it. She suffered. This woman is just endless suffering, and we haven't even gotten to some of the worst parts of her life. This same friend defended her against accusations of insanity, saying that whatever Mary Lincoln suffered from, it was heartbreak, not insanity. While abroad, Mary's friends helped her in her fight to get a pension. She had been waiting as the bill sat in Congress with no movement. It was this fight, like any other political fight before, that revived Mary's spirits as she wrote to senators to champion her cause. She told them that she could not, quote, live in a style becoming to the widow of the chief magistrate of a great nation. Although I live as economically as I can, end quote, which reminds me of her defending her spending to her husband. I think she was like, I've never been more economical than I have now, even as she was spending the $6,000 on wallpaper. But true, she was living in, I don't want to say out and out poverty, but certainly she was living in low rate, inexpensive hotels in Germany. She hoped for a $5,000 pension, which was the amount that congressmen made. So it raised a few eyebrows. Of course, the press made fun of Mary, thinking it strange that she would ask for a pension when she had the means to live abroad. And on that point, had she not abandoned the United States?
Which has just given her so much.
It's just frustrating. They're like, okay. She fled because she wanted some peace. She was sick of being stared at, of the press tearing her apart. You tear her apart and then you wonder why she's left you. Mary did have supporters like her old friend Charles Sumner. Sure you recognize the name?
Oh, yeah.
Famous for being caned on the Senate floor before the Civil War.
He does go on to do other things, but sadly, most people meet him in history flat on his back.
God.
While Preston Brooks is hitting him in the forehead with his birch bark cane. It's an awkward introduction, but yeah, he's a very principled, progressive, pro-civil rights, radical Reconstruction senator.
And he's really loyal to Mary, so I will give him his due. He's very loyal to her and to the memory of Abraham Lincoln. The House did finally approve on a partisan vote a $3,000 pension. So not the $5,000, but still, Mary was happy when she found out all the way in Germany. But it still had to be taken up by the Senate. I was going to say, if you're not an American or you're let's just say, a person who's the head of our government who doesn't know how government works, it goes to the House and then it goes to the Senate.
You mean if the president wants to spend money, there's a process to just...
Supposedly there is a process.
Oh, I had no idea. Tell me more how this is supposed to work.
This is how it should work. House, Senate, then it goes to the president to sign.
Oh.
Did I get that right?
Well, that sounds right. It does.
Okay, good.
I'm coughing a little bit as I hear that, but...
Yeah. In the Senate, that's where a lot of dirty laundry about Mary was aired. They called her greedy, wondering why she needed a pension when she had just inherited money from her husband. They compared her financial situation to the situation of most war widows, which I do understand. These other widows of the war are not getting $3,000. I get that, but she's not any normal widow. Did she think that she deserved to have the highest annuity granted to any American citizen? It got very nasty very quick. To quote the book, quote, several senators launched one of the harshest assaults ever made against anyone, male or female, in a 19th century Congress, end quote. They insinuated infidelity, whether we mentioned... If you remembered in episode 2, we talked about the possibility of her having a not platonic relationship with the Commissioner of Public Affairs who helped with the redecoration of the White House. They compared her unfavorably to Martha Washington. So I'm like, okay, we can't all be Martha Washington. Regardless, at the end, on a partisan vote, again, with 1/3 of the Senate abstaining, the pension bill passed 3 years after it had been first introduced, which is crazy. It took 3 years for this to happen. It would double Mary's income, although, again, at great cost to her reputation. Her reputation, it's taken hits from the clothing debacle, and now she's got the pension, but a lot of dirty laundry. For a woman at that time, your greatest asset was your reputation. And Mary's it's not great right now. After the pension victory, Mary's life changed in more than just a financial way. After 2 years, the pull of home proved too much. Tad had wanted to go home, and Mary also desired to see her new grandbaby, of course. You can't keep a grandma away from a grandbaby.
Yeah, even an ocean can't do that.
Mm-mm. Back they went to the United States in 1870. First, Mary and Tad had stayed with Robert and his wife, but the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law did not get along well. So all those beautiful letters that Mary had written, once they were under the same roof, no. Soon after, Mary and Tad relocated to a hotel. At that time, Tad had a cough. It was just like a cold they suspected from travel.
No.
Travel back to the U.S.?
No.
No. But instead of improving, Tad's condition worsened. Soon, Mary had to buy a chair, to which the boy sat day and night as it pained him too much to recline. The chair had a bar to prevent him from falling out of it. It wasn't a cold. It was pleurisy. Thanks to a bacterial infection, fluid was filling his cavities around the lungs. In time, this buildup would cause heart failure. The 18-year-old's extremities turned blue. It became clear at that point to everybody that there would be no recovery, although Mary seems to have held out hope until the very end, even as people around her knew the inevitable. On July 15th, 1871, Tad heeled over in his chair and breathed his last. This is the third son that Mary had lost. I can't believe. It's hard enough to get through talking about it, let alone living this experience. And she mostly had to mourn alone as Robert left 10 days after Tad's death to go to the Rocky Mountains to get away. To be fair to him, he's grieving too. It's his brother. He's going there to go out into the wilderness and grieve, but that left Mary alone. She's very much alone. And he's gone for a whole month. And she did what she did when she lost somebody. She mourned excessively and she shopped a lot. It wasn't just the act of shopping. She was buying multiples of things, multiple gloves, and also buying things that she didn't need, such as dozens of curtains for a house she did not own as she was staying at a hotel in Chicago. She often spoke a lot to the clerks at the stores, recounting her life and its tragedies. Yeah, again, she'd tell people about the assassination. She was lonely. She needed somebody to talk to, and without her son there, these clerks were the best thing that she had. What Mary did not know at the time was that she was being watched.
The surviving son.
Oh, I keep saying it, but I really can't imagine at this point how she's surviving in the world. You had little Eddie before the presidency. You had Willie during the Civil War. You had the stress of a civil war. You have your husband dying, and not just dying, but being killed violently in front of you as you're holding his hand. And now your baby, the remaining baby of the family, at least the only quote-unquote benefit of Tad's death was that she was there and she was at his bedside. He wasn't in a coma. He was awake until he died. If you're weighing the benefits, that's little comfort. I just don't know how anybody deals with that. So if you want to shop and talk to clerks, God knows there are much worse things that you could be doing to contend with that grief, you know?
Buying stuff you don't need. It's hard to think of any more American way of coping than that.
That is, I mean, I do that and I'm not mourning anything.
Maybe she's just foreshadowing a much more modern country where that's kind of everybody's default coping mechanism.
I'm like, if you want to buy curtains, if you want to buy 5 curtains, honestly, you do it. It's fine. I'm okay with it. On May 19th, 1875, 3 men turned up to Mary's door in the morning. She opened it as she'd been expecting a delivery of her latest shopping purchases, of course. Always the demure hostess, Mary greeted them. It was Leonard Sweet, a lawyer known to her as he had nominated her husband for president back in 1860, along with 2 officers. The Sweet told Mary that she had to come with him now to go to the courthouse. There was to be a trial about her sanity, or perhaps better put, her insanity. She had been charged with, quote, lunacy. Illinois was one of only 3 states which allowed for public trials for involuntary commitments. Your friends with great unanimity have come to the conclusion that the trials you have been called to pass through have been too much and have produced mental disease, the lawyer told an aghast Mary. You mean to say I am crazy? Mary asked him. I am much obliged to you, but I am abundantly able to take care of myself. Where is my son Robert? In fact, she would soon find out that Robert was waiting at the courthouse. It was Robert who had doomed Mary to this trial. It had been his idea. He had paid Pinkerton detectives.
Hey, they're back.
There's always a Pinkerton.
Have a lot of cameos in the podcast. Maybe there's one in the room right now. We just can't find them.
I mean, they're really good. It's like, what is it in Arrested Development? I'm just going to assume that Pinkertons are like Gene Parmesan. Gene, he's so good.
But what's the school in Arrested Development that they attend where they learn how to disappear into the background?
Milford School.
There we go. Children should not be seen or heard.
But yeah, he had paid the Pinkertons to follow Mary, watching her shop, watching her spend money. He had hired maids at hotels as well, all to get their testimony, and supposedly also paid the store clerks 2 weeks' wages in order to testify against his mother. And all the while Mary having no idea, he planned out the case. He got the doctors and other witnesses who would testify against Mary. He would have 6 doctors who had already signed statements that Mary was insane without ever having met her. Because why would you need to meet somebody when you're getting paid? Just telling them what he wants to hear.
Yeah, it's vibes. You just go by the vibes.
Well, the vibes were bad, according to the doctors. They were all paid to say that, of course, Mary did not want to go to the courthouse, and she hoped to change her clothes before. She's just stalling, but the men would not let her. Then, supposedly, before she goes to the courthouse, she threw up her hands and prayed to God, and she called upon her husband to release her. She did eventually, of course, go to the courthouse. She had no choice. Robert helped her be seated before she found out about his duplicity. What a good doting son. You're helping your mom get seated.
Wow.
Who knows what would have been going through Mary's brain at this point. And she had no chance. Robert had planned this to a T. The verdict had essentially been decided before the trial had begun. The trial was just a formality. Mary would be forced to hear witness after witness declare her insane, maids mentioning her fear of being alone and paying them to stay with her. There was a housekeeper noting she heard voices through the walls, and a cleaning woman describing her nervousness. Sales clerks testified about her spending sprees, including multiple gloves, 3 watches for Robert, and curtains which remained unopened in her hotel room. The star witness and the most damning testimony came from Robert, her only surviving son, who insisted he wasn't acting out of greed, as he had always supported his mother financially. This was all out of worry for her. The book says, quote, the next day, the Chicago papers commented sympathetically on his pallid, tear-flecked face, end quote. Perhaps the most famous of Robert's words as witness would be, quote, I have no doubt my mother is insane. She has long been a source of great anxiety to me. She has no home and no reason to make these purchases, end quote. Mary's lawyer called no witnesses, not even Mary herself. Not that it would have helped. During the recess from the court, Robert attempted to speak to his mother.
I think understandably she's probably not on board for that conversation.
Nope. She rebuked him, saying, "Oh, Robert, to think my son would do this to me." I would have a lot more choice words to say. So, Mary, the restraint that you have, bravo. At the end of the trial, Mary was to be institutionalized the next day, and her money under a conservatorship with her son turned enemy, Robert, at the helm. Think Britney Spears. Can't touch her money. Mary cowered in the corner as her sentence was read out, which is perhaps one of the more tragic details about the trial. Mary would never forget or forgive Robert's betrayal. It was not just a private humiliation. Her condition and predicament splashed across the national papers. President Lincoln's widow was a lunatic. Another sad chapter in the life of the demented widow, ran one headline. It was a media circus, as you can imagine. This is the wife of their martyred president. People had great interest in what was happening in Mary's life. Mary Todd Lincoln's life has many unforgettable chapters, but this one might be the most jaw-dropping. Just the betrayal of her one remaining son, the callousness in which it was done. I know people are going to be asking why. Why would he do this? Did Robert really think that she was crazy? Did he really think that his mother needed help? Was there other reasons? It's hard to say. We're not in Robert's head. We know what he said, but obviously people lie. People don't always tell the truth of what they're doing, so we do have to contend with that. The book does indicate that in terms of expenses, there were none greater than Robert himself. Mary had given him a lot of money, $25,000 in total already, in addition to interest-free loans, which he asked for as part of a real estate scheme he had going on, which he always seemed to lose money on. He was always doing one thing or the other, and none of it made money. It seems apparent to me that Robert was worried Mary would spend the rest of what should be his inheritance. I don't want to say that he was not also concerned about his mother's well-being. We know he hated her foray into spiritualism and worried that she would be taken advantage of by mediums or crooks. At the time, spiritualism was very controversial, and we know there was a woman whose husband, I think it was in Illinois itself, that he would institutionalize her just because she was in spiritualism. Sorry, babe, you're a little bit too interested in seances, so we got to lock you up. It's just really hard to find a way to defend Robert Lincoln, which, as you can imagine, as I'm getting worked up over this, if Robert Lincoln has no haters, I'm dead. Matt, you can confirm this, because after researching this part, I stormed in the kitchen and yelled about Robert for a while.
I mean, yeah, he's doing better than Herndon, but that's not saying much. I'm not an expert, but what little I know about this particular chapter, there are some historians who think that Robert's motives might have been self-serving, that he was trying to gain access to her assets. I think the majority of historians think that, for the most part, he was acting out of what he thought were some kind of authentic concern for his mother.
I was trying to present that when I was saying, like, we know that he says that even privately, not just to the public, but to other people, that he's really concerned. And he might be, because he is a very, very different person than Mary. Just because we don't see her actions as something to institutionalize her doesn't mean that he doesn't feel like it. People are complicated. Perhaps it was a little bit of that, but also a little bit of, I don't want her to spend all what should be my money. Like, could be a little bit of everything. That's human nature.
I think there's a third possible explanation. Well, we should probably back up, and we knock on door number one. Door number one would be authentic concern for his mother's state of mind.
which I do think there is.
You're not completely dismissing him.
No, I am a Robert Lincoln hater, but I do think that just based on who he was and his personality, that he would perceive his mother's actions as reckless, dangerous, even insane.
Right. And then door number 2 would be the potential for some kind of financial gain, although she did have assets that he had control over during that time that he immediately returned to her, including some pretty valuable jewelry and some personal property.
Well, he returns the jewelry because she
does demand it back. That's true.
We will get to that.
I don't think we have any evidence he was going to hawk it, though.
From what we can tell, it's not like he raised the money. I think it's more the protection piece of, I'm worried she's going to spend it all and there's not going to be anything left for me. Not that I need to get my hands on it now to use.
I think that's definitely something that has to, stay in the balance of consideration. But I think the third possibility is that from Robert's vantage point, ever since he was in the White House as a young man alongside his father, he was being compared to his father. And he wanted to serve. He didn't want the president's son to be perceived as having this special halo of protection that kept him from harm's way during the Civil War.
Mary's, particularly after Willie died, she didn't want him in the Army at all, but eventually, we know.
He gets attached to Grant's command staff.
He's at Appomattox Courthouse when Lee surrenders.
He's not commanding. He's not in a frontline combat role. But then in the aftermath of his father's death, the comparisons are, of course, going to be inevitable. He goes on to be a prominent attorney, and he serves in James Garfield's cabinet before Garfield is also assassinated.
Which we will get to.
By all accounts, we can always assume that for the rest of his life, every professional relationship he ever had, as soon as it got past that initial introductory phase where, you're having coffee with a law partner or you're having a shot of whiskey after work. I don't know if he was a big drinker or not. But what I'm getting at here is, there's just no way around it. Whenever anybody for the rest of his life felt that they knew him well enough to go into this headspace, they would start asking him about.
Tell me about your dad.
April of 1865.
The only person who would ever know what that feels like is JFK Jr.
Exactly. And so I think it's legitimate to ask, especially when you throw in the grave robbing attempts,
which we talked about in the assassination. So if you want to hear about that, go to the 160th anniversary assassination episode.
It's just unavoidable that I think every time Mary externalizes her grief, every time I don't want to say she's making it a show. She's not. It's very real for her, but a callous public kind of perceives it that way. And I think for Robert, it's like an anchor that's pulling him back to 1865. And he's just desperate to try to move beyond 1865. He knows realistically on some level it's never going to be a complete break.
Yeah.
But to the extent that Mary is still being Mary, he feels like he can't move on. And therefore, it's time, without any due process whatsoever, to
lock her up.
Commit my mother to a mental institution. However, once she's in there, the public I know this is probably where you're headed next.
Yeah, I am sympathetic to Robert's position in a way, but I guess the stuff that makes me upset is the spying on her, the paying people. I know that that's just what he had to do to get her committed involuntarily, but it's just the betrayal again.
Well, for the record, Robert Todd, I'm reading here right now, was apparently a teetotaler. So it would not have been a shot of whiskey. Now, maybe he should have considered a shot of whiskey or two.
That would have settled him. I already mentioned, too, that, her and Robert, Mary and Robert, and Abraham, just completely different personalities. Robert was said not to be like either of his parents. He was very, say, stoic, didn't have the sense of humor of his father, didn't have the emotional capacity of his mother. A lot of people present him as really boring, which I'm sorry. I don't want to say Robert Lincoln that you're boring, that you're basic, but you're kind of a basic bitch in a way. Sorry. Oh, no, I don't want to apologize because actually you're a bad man. Anyway, I just will say to round this up that I knew about, obviously, her insanity trial, the stay at the asylum, but I guess I always assumed that there was more of a reason behind it, that there was more than what we've just presented. Even in the terms of the definition of insanity at the time, Mary's case was flimsy at best. At least for Mary, the institution, Bellevue Place, a private asylum in Batavia, Illinois, was more genteel than the public hospitals. And this is where I'll say, shout out Batavia. Batavia is when my mama was born, and it is close to Geneva, where I spent a large chunk of my childhood. So shout out Geneva,
Which
shout
is
out
a
Batavia.
really fun little town in the greater Chicago metropolitan area that
Yes.
we love. Geneva. Geneva's a fun place.
So if you want to take a little pilgrimage, actually the Geneva History Museum, they have some information on Bellevue Place, the asylum, because it's really close. And compared to the other women there, no more than 25 women total. Mary, she wasn't drugged. She wasn't mistreated in any way, probably thanks to her status as a presidential widow, but also because of her good behavior. We know at least a few months before Mary arrived, there was one woman who had been given a fatal overdose of chloral, which is what Mary had been taking for her insomnia leading up to her institutionalization. So, yikes. There's certainly some really bad behavior, some drugging, some not so great conditions. But Mary, she did pretty well. She had free roam mostly. Robert came to visit too. He'd indicate to a friend that they were on good terms. He quoted the best of terms, which is hilarious because we'll see that whatever he was perceiving, he was not picking up on the right vibes from Mary, or maybe she was just putting on a show for him so that she could leave. But it's hilarious in hindsight for him to be like, she's fine. I'm visiting. Mom's not mad at me at all for locking her up here. But Mary was still under strict watch. Her mail was read and monitored, which would cause conflict between her and the staff. To those who thought Mary did not seem like she needed to be there among the women suffering from much worse mental illness, Robert said that she was very good at feigning normality when she had an object or goal in mind. Robert's like, yeah. She seems like she's doing well, but she's gaming the system, essentially.
This is foreshadowing of a very infamous psychology experiment, the Rosenhan study. Are you familiar with this?
No.
Rosenhan, we shouldn't be departing like this, but I think I can explain it in less than a minute.
Okay.
He was a psychologist who just decided, I'm going to test the diagnostic mettle of a mental health institution. So he walked up to the intake desk and said, I'm hearing voices. It bothers me. I don't know where these voices are coming from. And it's a total lie. He just made it up. They took down his information. They committed him. Next day, he says, I feel fine. The voices are gone. I'm normal. But that begins this process where he's trapped. He can't get out. No matter what he does, they think it's part of his psychosis.
Oh, no.
Including when he starts to explain, look, this was part of an experiment on my part.
Oh.
I'm actually a professional. And they go, of course. That is exactly what you would say, right?
Yeah, that is what a crazy person would say. Oh, no.
Exactly.
He's probably like, oh, why did I have to do this? This is where I'm back to Arrested Development.
Yeah.
I've made a huge mistake.
Right. This is like almost exactly 100 years after she's committed. I think it was done in 73 or 74. But this is what's happening to her is she's behaving in a perfectly rational way, but everybody perceives it as mental illness.
Yeah, like she can put on a show when she needs to. And in this instance, that object was obviously to get out of Bellevue as soon as humanly possible. She was released after only 3 months and 3 weeks, which is one of the shortest stays there. A lot of these women, unfortunately, stayed there for much longer. Robert fought it strongly. He's not giving up. He even accused Mary of wanting to kidnap his daughter, which seems like a complete fabrication. I do not know where that came from. But Mary had allies. She was somehow able to smuggle out letters to people like Myra Bradwell and her husband James, who was a judge. Both were lawyers. Despite Myra being a woman, she was unable to practice law. Myra and Mary had been friends through the spiritualist scene, and it was through their help that Mary got out of Bellevue. Thank you, Myra. Thank you, James. They were able to successfully get her out, but her money would still be under Robert's control for another year. But at least she was out of the institution itself. It would be to her elder sister Elizabeth Edwards' house that Mary went, just as she had done when she lived in Springfield for the first time. So much had happened in the meantime: the war, her husband's death, losing 2 more sons. Elizabeth, her sister, and many others would testify that Mary was just as she had always been: eccentric, unique, sure, but insane, no. According to the letters, Mary was socializing in Springfield, visiting old friends, and was generally in high spirits. There seemed nothing amiss about her at all, which surprised the Edwardses, as they had expected the worst after all the stories they had read in the newspapers. They would conclude that the cause of whatever erratic behavior that Mary had exhibited was because of the use of a sedative, chloral, which I already mentioned, from Bellevue, which Mary had used in order to sleep in those horrible days after Tad died. They're thinking that it was the sedative that perhaps would have made her behave in a more erratic way than they were seeing now. Elizabeth and her husband championed Mary against her son, writing to Robert to try to ease his mind, or at least make him willing to give Mary back full control over her money. Robert had been receiving reports from his spies, because of course he had spies, that Mary had returned to spending and giving IOUs in Springfield. So he was none too pleased that she was back to her old tricks. Elizabeth's letters in particular make some really compelling points about Mary, especially in regards to her shopping, saying that it was, quote, the only available pleasure that Mary had left, which is true. Mary had lived through unspeakable tragedy. What did it matter? She spent her money. Like, it was her money. She could spend it how she liked. And the Edwardses reminded Robert that even if she happened to blow all of her money on shopping, which would be a lot, but let's say she did, she would still have her pension. Though Robert always worried that the pension would be taken away, which that never happened, nor was there any real threat of it, even when the Democrats took control of the House. So he's still not super thrilled. In Elizabeth's letters to her nephew, she attempted to get him to stop trying to make Mary into someone she was not. Like it or not, Mary was who she was. There was no changing it. Quote, the most availing remedy in life's trials is to let them alone when you have done what you could, Elizabeth wrote. Robert fought this idea, though. In his mind, as the oldest and only son left, he was doing his duty to his mother, protecting her from herself, which was what we were mentioning when we were weighing why he decided to do this. That does give you some insight into Robert's mindset. He was still, though, planning on admitting his mother once again to Bellevue in the spring of 1876, which is unbelievable. After all this, he was lining things up, but Mary had support this time around. She knew what was happening. She had her sister and brother-in-law, and outmaneuvered Robert. In the back and forth, Mary even offered a little threat to disinherit Robert and instead leave her remaining money to the Springfield Home for the Friendless.
Nice move.
I do love that name for the charity, but yeah, I'm like, checkmate. There you go. Robert, you want to lock me up? Well, you're not getting my money. At last, whether Robert liked it or not, Mary was restored to her full freedom including that of her money in June of 1876. A jury had declared her, quote, restored to reason and capable to manage and control her estate, end quote. The newspapers once again recorded this occasion, with the Chicago Times stating, Mrs. Abraham Lincoln restored to her reason and freedom, end quote. It should have been a happy occasion, but by this point, the relationship between mother and son was irrevocably broken. Robert and Mary would never reconcile. There are even reports of Mary perhaps proclaiming that she wanted to kill Robert. I'm going to say this was an empty threat, but some people did tell him that she was quoted as saying that she wanted to kill him. She would call him her, quote, monster of mankind son. Mary would send back all the admittedly few things that Robert had bought her over the years and demanded Robert do the same. When you get to this point, it's a victory. She's got everything back, but it's poignant that Mary would lose 3 out of her 4 children and be estranged from the last remaining one, which meant she didn't get to see her granddaughter. If fate had worked in a kinder manner, Mary and Abraham would be enjoying the post-presidency, surrounded by their children and their grandchildren. And yeah, she's really pretty much alone. She has her sister and her brother-in-law, but this is not how she would have expected to live out the twilight years of her life. Mary would flee the United States once again just a year after getting out of Bellevue, both to get away from the public shame and stares after all the coverage in the newspapers, and because she honestly feared Robert might institutionalize her again at any moment, not an unfounded fear. France offered refuge for her. She would have some friends, but it was on a lonely existence, finding comfort in reading and writing letters. Ulysses S. Grant and Julia Grant would visit the area in 1879, but either purposefully or accidentally snubbed Mary. Mary felt it was the former. Julia Grant would later say that they had no idea Mary was in town until after they had left. Mary was very upset after this. She would remain in France until her health deteriorated badly. She had lost an immense amount of weight. She was down to only about 100 pounds. And her arthritis hurt her. She's reported to have fallen down a flight of stairs, no longer having the strength to hold one of her sides up, so it just gave out and she fell down. A woman perpetually on the move before, her health was catching up with her. She had, according to the doctors, a chronic inflammation of the spinal cord, kidney disease, a cataract, and more. It's likely she had diabetes at this point as well. No longer able to care for herself, the 62-year-old Mary would make one final trip across the sea back to the United States in 1880. She returned back to Springfield, back to her sister's home, along with her 64 trunks of things. Can you imagine 64 trunks? Elizabeth was in equally poor health. The book recounts stories of local children pointing out the home as the place where the crazy woman lived. That was what Mary was known for, not for being the widow of a great president or the deeds she had accomplished as First Lady. With her bad health and nearly blind, thanks to her many tears, according to herself, Mary would spend most of the time in her room. She was not done fighting, though. After President Garfield was assassinated in 1881, his widow received a $5,000 pension. Even if she was blind, Mary could see slights against her. No. If Mrs. Garfield received $5,000, it was only fair that she should receive that as well. Mary launched into a writing campaign, energized by this fight, using her poor health to her advantage to strengthen her case, and she won in the end. Her pension was increased, and she was to receive $15,000 in back payments. Go Mary. But Mary would not get to enjoy the victory. On July 15th, 1882, which was the anniversary of Tad's tragic death, Mary collapsed at her sister's home. She would die the next day of a stroke. At long last, Mary was reunited in death with her beloved husband and her 3 sons in the Oak Ridge Cemetery, as she had always wanted. A sad little end to one of the most consequential first ladies in our history. Now that we finished her story, you know what that means.
Well, now see, last time it meant that I had to add a really sad postscript. Do you want a sad postscript?
Oh, no. Are you going to make me cry again right
No.
before we go into the judgment?
I think this is more about being angry than being sad.
Okay. I'm okay with righteous anger, so lay it on me.
Well, so one of the paradoxes towards the end of her life is that when she does get institutionalized, it's her own money that's being used to pay the doctors on Robert's behalf who keep going in. Right. When she does pass away, as far as we know, if she did have a will, it clearly would not have named Robert. As you spoke to earlier, he wasn't going to be identified as the person to take over the estate. But because that will was destroyed, it went into probate. And in Illinois, that meant he got it all. So, not that was some huge fortune, but it was just one final little painful footnote.
Even though she felt betrayed, I'm sure in some ways he was the last one standing. So who knows? Maybe that is what ultimately she would want. Maybe not necessarily for him, but for, her grandchildren. Who knows?
And of course, none of the newspapers that had anything charitable to say about her when she was alive, the most glowing things were said about her.
That's always what happens. It is judgment time. And as always, per protocol for the podcast, since I presented, I will go first. This one's very hard because I have thought a lot about Mary in the last few weeks. Mary's been on my mind a lot, and she's actually come up in the news. I don't know if you've seen this. There's this popular play. It's on Broadway. It was nominated for some Tonys. It's called Oh, Mary. It's a comedy about Mary Todd Lincoln.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, I think there was like a CBS Mornings or something. I think it was last weekend. Did like an interview with the creator. This is not to disparage the show because it's not supposed to be a true biographical play on Mary. The creator basically said, I did no research for it. I just based on what everybody knows off of her. So again, it's not a true biographical play. That's not the intent of it. But seeing her played for laughs, it makes me a little bit sad because, as you've probably realized, as we've talked about her, Mary Todd Lincoln's life, it's a tragedy. There are things to poke fun of, and we've done so. And some aspects like the spending and the White House, the wallpaper. But this is a woman who lost 3 out of her 4 children. That last son betrayed her horribly, which caused her to be estranged from Robert for the rest of her life. She saw her beloved husband, this man that she loved, that was everything to her, killed in front of her. And she's a woman who longed for acceptance and praise, and instead she always got lambasted in the press. There was literally nothing she could do, it seemed like, without the press being all over her for it. And then she's judged as crazy. She's institutionalized on top of it. Even if she was declared that she's no longer insane. That's not the story that gets told. We focus on the insanity part. It's just trauma after trauma after trauma. I know it's more complicated than this, but I just don't see why we treat Mary as an object of derision versus somebody like Jackie Kennedy. I know you don't like I'm not trying to compare Lincoln and Kennedy's assassination. I'm not saying they're the same, but if you're going to compare presidential widows, I feel like Jackie Kennedy gets a much fairer shake than Mary. She was also a clothes horse, but she was praised for that, unlike Mary. Some of those same things that we admire about Jackie, we don't like about Mary. I will say that going in, I really suspected a lot of the anger towards Mary would be based in, would say it with me, good old misogyny. And make no mistake, misogyny does play a role in this, I think. But I do think the money issues in the White House the debts, that did feel more substantial than I suspected going in. I'm not going to try to excuse everything about it. I know we gave some nuance to it in our episode on her White House years, but I don't love it. I don't love the little tricks that she used to overspend. I think she could have done better, although it's clear that shopping really was Mary's way of coping with stress, with loss. This is where you're like, if she had therapy, maybe she'd have healthier ways to cope, but no therapy.
Yeah, not available.
Nope, I can understand why she did it and had a hard time stopping. Like, if I was going to give her a number, I don't know, maybe like 60-40 good?
Why? Oh,
What?
why not just go 95-5?
Oh, you think I'm being too hard on her?
Well, other than the spending.
You always think, like with Mark Andy, you always think that I'm too easy.
Well, I was kind of hard on Mark Antony, wasn't I?
Is this the reverse?
Oh, maybe I'm just being difficult to make for good listening. But what's other than the spending during wartime is tone deaf. But otherwise,
I don't think she was the easiest person to get along with. I think she created a lot of unnecessary
friction,
not just personally, but it did create real problems. I don't necessarily know if I would get along with her. Maybe 64, I don't know, like 65. Would that be 65-35? Am I doing the math right? Is that?
Yeah, that adds up to 100.
100?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Okay, good. Maybe 65-35.
I'm still more positive.
Wow.
I mean, not that we have to agree.
I think it's funny that the criteria that you used for Mark Antony, you were like in that place and time, he was not doing what he should have. In her place and time, don't you think Mary was overstepping some of those things?
Now we're breaking two cardinal sins. So you're never supposed to do the hypothetical thing. Yeah, history is hard enough just figuring out what did happen. You shouldn't burn brain cells trying to figure out what could have happened, right? And then, of course, the second thing we're doing is we're making these moral and ethical judgments across, in this case, not just decades, but centuries. But to answer your question, the reason why I'm harder on him is because he has agency. He has power. He has an army.
That's true.
She's in a world where women are considered to be the property of their husbands, you know.
She's just doing her best. That's true. I think on a whole, I'm very sympathetic. And I talked about going in the first episode about how looking out on the internet, not a very friendly place to Mary Todd Lincoln. And I think that is overblown. If you probably dove into the tenure of some of other first ladies, you might find some similar themes going on. But I also don't want to discount and say, again, this is all misogyny and that she never did anything wrong in her life. Because do you think she was a prickly person? You wouldn't want to get on her bad side. The money thing, yeah. Ill-advised at best. Does that make her a bad person if she had a shopping addiction? No, not really. As a person, she's not always the most likable. But, I mean, God, as you get to her later life, just tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. I don't know how likable I would be at that point, honestly. And you know, again, having to deal with people trying to mine her husband's legacy with the Anne Rutledge saga. If she had just gone berserk and killed William Herndon, I'd honestly understand at that point. She's a complicated woman, but I do think there is a lot to commend her on, the fact that she's able to soldier on, get on with life, and to the people whose friendship she did keep. For the most part, she's a good friend. She loved her children. She loved her husband. You wish that she had had a simpler life, an easier life, and had just been able to have her family, and that would have been it. But obviously, that's not the fate that she was dealt.
I understand why we probably disagree, but I can't walk away from the fact that even without any of the tragedies in her life, she's not in a society that's going to listen to her, that's going to value her.
Yes.
So I guess I'm willing to factor that into my score.
Maybe I'm overthinking it in a lot of ways. You could see comparisons to people like Jackie Kennedy, or even, God, way back, one of the early pods talked about Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and all the press intrusion and crap she had to put up with. And also a person who had a lot of things to like about, but she could be rough around the edges at times. That's kind of what she was made into because of, again, the press intrusion. I guess you could say the same thing about Mary. Whatever softness that she has is destroyed by trauma, by the press, then, by this insanity trial. I don't know how soft and easy I would be after coming out of all of that. I do think that she doesn't get enough credit for her White House years. It wasn't just spending. We talked a lot about during the war. She loved going to the hospitals. Even the press admitted that it probably would have been better off if she had taken the press there instead of friends. If they had publicized that more, then the public would know that she's doing this instead of just hearing the things about she's spending $6,000 on the wallpaper and $3,000 on China. But because she didn't do that, it was more of a case of not getting the PR right versus she was actually doing this good stuff.
And I think that's a situation, too, where she's having to learn how to play that role without knowing, this sounds very stupid, but she has to learn how to play that role without knowing what the future holds. When the Civil War starts, both sides think, oh, this will take 6 weeks. This will take 6 months.
It'll be months, yeah.
And so you could totally understand this idea. Well, then we must conduct ourselves in the White House with a sense of this physical space has to convey a certain majesty and pomp because we're going through a crisis and we have to show that we're stable and we're muscular and robust. This is going to be the enduring republic, and it's also going to be worthy of an admiring eye from a European observer or a diplomatic guest. We're going to make this White House a place of true splendor. And then as the war starts to become more and more brutal and slow and ugly, it's like, okay, well, then now what am I supposed to do? Well, I guess I can back away from all of that. But the White House is also the one place where the president can wine and dine and influence and lobby and persuade.
And he's not really, they don't really leave. Lincoln leaves very rarely. So it's like, it's kind of like, if you're going to hunker down, might as well be a nice place to be.
Yeah, all of which is to say, if you're looking for like ways to rationalize her conduct, they're out there. I think her whole life, there are ways to do that.
The book presents her personality that she suffers from narcissism. Don't love declaring that stuff wholesale. She's been dead how many years? So maybe we don't diagnose it. I do think she had these ideas of grandeur, and sometimes she acted in ways that, again, she wanted the praise, she wanted the acclaim. And when she didn't get it, she would act it out almost, rinse, repeat. In a lot of these instances, she didn't help herself, but especially the wartime, stressful time, we talked about that she's not spending a lot of time with her husband, one of their sons. They're supposedly, if you have favorites, you're not supposed to have favorites, but supposedly their favorite son died. He's finding ways to cope. I don't know what that would do to anybody. In those circumstances, it would warp you. You would behave in perhaps erratic or ways that we might not necessarily think is healthy, like the spending. She's focused on the White House because that's all that she can do. She's not in war meetings. She's not spending time with her husband. The one thing that she can really do is plan parties and decorate the White House. So she pours herself into that. That's pretty much all she has.
And it's also the only way that she can retaliate against her critics. Lincoln faces bad press or a scathing editorial or an accusation from Congress. He can give a speech or he can lobby behind the scenes for,
Yeah.
policy changes. He can fire a general. Ultimately, he has to stand for reelection. But the point is, he has tools. I mean, he can suspend habeas corpus. She doesn't have any of those tools. So when people accuse her husband of being a baboon, the only thing she can do is to say, well, would a baboon sit on a couch from Austria surrounded by,
No.
$12,000 wall finishings from France? It sounds crass. It sounds silly, but it's something you can explain, to be sure.
Yeah, it's also a vision of the White House and the presidency that would be confirmed in the future. We talked about how America's not a superpower at that point. The White House was kind of dilapidated and really needed some upkeep when they arrived. She has a vision that's much more in line with our modern view. She's a little bit ahead of her time. Maybe if it had been 20, 30, 40 years later, people wouldn't necessarily scoff at the ways that she's updating and trying to make it into, I don't want to say something palatial. Again, it's a symbol. It's not just the place that the president lives, but it is a symbol of our republic. And if it looks dilapidated and dirty and falling down, that doesn't bode well. That's not a good sign for the state of our republic.
I think she's definitely aware of that.
So I do think, a lot of ways she's just a little bit ahead of her time. Same with the dresses and the fashion is not necessarily like, I need the latest and greatest. It's, well, I've just been living in Springfield. There were reports about them being like, she's from this backwater. And she's like, okay, well, I'm going to play the part. People always disparage fashion, but there are women who use fashion to their advantage, like an armor or to play a part, that they can put a dress on and suddenly I'm not Mary Todd, I'm the First Lady, Mrs. Lincoln. Suddenly you're transformed. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's how she's using fashion. It's not just to spend money. It's a little bit like her armor.
She's going to need, even after her biggest moments in the spotlight, she still has to deal with people like, at the risk of bringing his name up again, Herndon trying to write the life story, because he really shows you there is so much power, so much dangerous power that comes from being an early biographer. If you're an early commentator, if you're the first person to get a record out there and you have any kind of like primary source connection to the subject that you're writing about, your story just has so many ripples, because it probably wasn't until the late 70s, early 1980s. I'm sure in your own research you bumped into this. She doesn't get reappraised until you're into the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah. Well, and even now, like I mentioned in the first episode, and I've talked to you about, there's a book out in the last couple of years that's about their marriage, and it is not kind to her. It basically says Lincoln married her because she seduced him and then he had to marry her. You're like, oh, it's just the same old trap saying that she's some sort of predatory woman who preyed on this very nice gentleman. We've talked, I love Abraham Lincoln. I love him. I have a soft spot for him, but he is still a man. He is still an imperfect man. He is not the sainted angel, and she's like the demon on his shoulder. Things are much more complicated than that. They always are. Do you want to wrap that up? I don't know if you have anything else to say about Mary, except for I just want to say that I'm proud that I didn't cry at any point during this one.
I don't know how to explain this, but even today, when somebody stumbles into one of my history classes when they're 17 or 18 years old, they already somehow have this image of Mary Todd Lincoln that sees her as unhinged and in some kind of hysterical orbit around reality.
Yeah, that's what the Oh Mary play is about.
And it's like, how does this how does this weave its way into every generation of American boys and girls? It's a hard thing to fathom. And this is kind of the primitive, like, armchair psychology theory that I've come to over the years, because when you teach U.S. history, I'm going to let you behind the curtain here. These are things only history teachers share with each other.
Ooh.
Because this is crass, and anyone overhearing the conversation would probably roll their eyes or sigh. But when you're trying to start your class in August or September in the 15th or 16th century, and you're trying to get as close to the present as you can by May, there's a school of thought. It's kind of a bumper sticker that, well, you have to be in Ford's Theater by Christmas. Lincoln has to be dead by Christmas.
I didn't know you had a date that you got to be in Ford's Theater.
Yeah, so if you walked by 2 or 3, especially AP U.S. history teachers, at a bar or something on a Friday night, especially if it's November, they'll have this conversation like, how far are you? Do you think you're gonna
get to Ford's Theater yet?
Do you think you'll have him dead by Christmas?
God.
I know, it's awful. It's just awful. But part of it then that starts to happen is, I have killed Lincoln,
Matthew,
5 or 6 times a year for like 30 plus years. So I'm kind of insulated somewhat from this whole experience. And I think in a weird sort of way, what Mary Todd does for people is, if you see her as the fringe, she can't process it. She's left reality, right? Well, then you can say to yourself, I am equally, even 50 years later, 100 years later, I am equally traumatized by this event. I cannot get over the tragedy of this event, but I haven't gone as far as she has. Boy, talk about a cautionary tale. Every time you think that you have obstacles in your life, you should look at her biography.
Oof.
And so people, I think, just put her out there at a distance. And when she's out there at a distance, that gives you kind of permission to poke fun at her and marginalize her and not really see her 3-dimensionally, because she's the cautionary tale of, well, you can't get too close to any of this because it will shred your brain.
It will. That's how I feel coming out of reading.
Yeah.
I, again, spent maybe a month thinking about her, doing research, writing about it. It's not an easy company to keep. I both like her more and like her less in some ways. It's really hard to describe. She's prickly in ways that I perhaps didn't expect, but looking at her early life, it really does lend an understanding to who she is. Her mom dies early, and her dad essentially abandons her, not through actual abandonment, but he has that second family, and she's not really welcome in that house. You can see where it's all leading. It makes sense on a whole. I do wonder, was there anything surprising or new that you got from it, or in any way that you think that it would help you better teach Lincoln or the Civil War, just out of curiosity?
Well, her conflict with Robert, I think, is, if you want students to have a personal connection, it's much more relatable to talk about a family conflict like that than to talk about Reconstruction amendments or the legacy of sharecropping or states' rights or any of the other kind of debris field that's left behind. I mean, it's humanizing, right? It's something that everybody can connect
Can understand. The podcast is not meant to, not every offender that we cover is meant to exonerate them in any way. That's not the point of the podcast, but I hope that it did humanize her for people who just think of her as, oh, the first lady who went crazy, the more salacious elements of her life. And I think that's why people are in a lot of ways drawn to her, even negatively, because there are those salacious things that make her stand out from the pack. The insanity trial, the assassination. But I'm hoping this proved a little bit of a character study, and it has humanized her in a way that perhaps you've not seen her before.
I think without a doubt. And I know that we probably have some people listening who feel like, why so much time on this one subject? But I do think you have to remember that these moments where somebody has a blood connection to a president, to someone in power, and then loses them, we don't always acknowledge it, I think, consciously, but we expect the survivor to go forward and continue the mission and continue the fight. I know the Bobby Kennedy's 68 campaign. For so many Americans, they were good or bad, right or wrong. They were assuming that his brother's legacy, which that was sort of the unspoken campaign mission. It's crude, but anyone would look at his coalition and his objectives and his I think we would now look back on it today and say, well, you very conveniently don't think the Vietnam War is a good idea now, but regardless of whether or not that's just shallow political opportunism, that's certainly what LBJ thought it was. But there's no way around it. People saw him as more progressive and more forward-looking and more open to change and more willing to broaden the Democratic coalition to include groups that hadn't previously been consciously included in it. And the same thing happens with Eleanor Roosevelt in her later years. There's almost this expectation we have that if you are in the inner circle of power, especially through family, kin, blood, marriage, that you're going to continue the fight in the next generation. And I think that's something else that bothers people about Mary is they're like, well, what were her thoughts on Reconstruction, and what were her thoughts on potential reconciliation with the North and the South?
She was a political animal, but in terms of campaigning, she was never an issues person. I don't know if she would have ever sat and thought about her positions on things. It was more about the campaign and the personnel and that kind of thing.
So it's kind of like back to the Mark Antony thing. Maybe I was expecting things from Mark Antony that are not, I don't know if realistic's the word. And maybe it's like expecting somebody who lives in, medieval Scotland to speak fluent French. Maybe it's just like, I'm sorry, this isn't something you can expect.
Well, they might, because that was a lingua franca, but I get your point.
Yeah. Well, right. Well, that's exactly what I mean. It's not like it isn't going to happen. Right. There can be a black swan, but it may not be as common as we want it to be. And in some ways, what we're doing there is we're projecting our own expectation of what Jack Kennedy would have become had he not gone to Dallas, or what Lincoln would have become had he not gone to Ford's Theater. And of course, we hope, right? It's an article of faith for an awful lot of people in my parents' generation that we would not have escalated in Vietnam. And it's an article of faith for a lot of Civil War historians that Lincoln would have been more artful and he could have drawn the country forward towards civil rights and integration. And boy,
I've said that. And I believe it off of vibes. I understand.
Yeah. And it's like a lot of cold, heartless historians will say, well, if we actually look at, yes, he's speaking in a way that implies he might start to have that vision, but
we just don't know.
And so we just go back and we fill in the gaps on our own. It's just like what your brain does with the blind spot, it just fills in what it hopes should be there.
Yeah. She was never going to be the Eleanor Roosevelt, like continuing on with her husband's mission. That was not possible at the time.
Yeah, not expected and
It was impossible. I don't even think you could even say Robert to his credit. He didn't even do that. As the eldest son, he was in government, but he knew his father cast a long shadow and knew that it would be impossible to live up to that. If the oldest son can't, certainly wouldn't expect that from the wife. But I think she held Lincoln's legacy in a more personal capacity, not on the political side, because to her, I think it was all much more personal.
Absolutely.
Anything else that you want to talk about? Otherwise, we'll sign off.
I think we're ready to tell people about the next episode. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys for sticking around on the Mary Todd Lincoln series. Thank you guys for listening as always. And we will pick up next time with our episode on we're going back in time. Speaking of Scotland, we're going to Scotland. Well, kind of.
Oh.
Scotland to England.
Well, this will be you, not me then.
It will be. We are going to be talking about George Villiers, who was a favorite of King James I of England.
Oh, a Stuart monarch. I know a little bit about that.
Stuart. You know the Stuarts. This is where you kind of have some knowledge.
We have to know, as as U.S. history people, we have to know a little bit about the Stuarts.
Yes.
You can't have a Jamestown without a James.
No, we will be diving into the crazy world of the Jacobean court. So until next time, thanks, guys. We love you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.